There's one bill, the Homeland Security Appropriations bill, that is still being debated over the wall funding, and that could simply be kicked into the new year, into February. This is so easily averted. The party that makes the policy demand owns the shutdown. And so I think on the Republican side, I mean, this is just a fight they cannot win, and they know it. Nancy Pelosi has no incentive to negotiate with Republicans between now and her swearing-in day on January the 3rd. Her position only gets stronger. So, I mean, I don't understand the point of this thing. It makes absolutely no sense.
As we look at this, the president, we know, when I believe it was December 11th, the Oval Office meeting with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. Listen, Democrats got one thing they wanted out of that meeting for sure. They got the president to say on camera, right, yeah, I will own this shutdown. The president, of course, now is not owning this shutdown, Joe, which probably could have been predicted as well. He's calling it the Democrats' shutdown. You know, as we just heard from Congressman Dent, there is no real incentive for Democrats either to give in here. But could there be a win in here for them if they did try to advance this in a different way moving in? Not do what everybody's expecting from them, but come January 3rd, extend even perhaps a little bit more of an olive branch.
Yeah, well, I don't know that an olive branch, it's certainly not warranted here, but if politically, if they could show a bipartisanship, you can't negotiate with someone who thinks he's winning. And Trump thinks he's winning this fight. And in a sense, he is winning this fight because he only cares about his base. And as Jess, properly pointed out, the deal collapsed because Ann Coulter and Sean Hannity didn't like it. As crazy as that sounds, it's true. So my view is I think the Democrats need to find something else that they want to help Trump save face. We talked a little bit last week about, I think, the biggest concern for Democrats, which is Trump will shut down the Mueller investigation by firing Mueller. They could certainly go to Trump now and say, in return for some border wall money, let's pass the bill that Senator Coons has been pushing that will protect Mueller and make sure it doesn't happen. I'm very concerned that he is going to fire Mueller.
The president would really get behind something like that?
If he could say, I got my border wall money, I could talk to his base, yes, I think he might. But we do need some new idea because right now there are no incentives to either side because both sides think they're winning this. Democrats are actually winning it. Trump just thinks he's winning it.
Right. And you know, to Joe's point, while that may sound like a modest proposal, on New Day last week, Mark Short said he would advise the president to take that deal, which is sort of interesting. But just let's talk about a deal because I think it's generally acknowledged, and Charlie Dent just said that Democrats have far more leverage here. Republicans don't. So what kind of a deal would you advise your fellow Democrats to take, either before the new year or after January 3rd when they come into power in the House?
I want to make sure that it stands on the principles that they are currently talking about. Saying that the wall is immoral is important. It is not just that it is bad, expensive policy that we were never supposed to have to pay for. It's actually wrong. So if we come in being able to say, this is what we stand for, we want to do right by the American people, there are so many investments that we need to be making in our country that we are simply not able to do right now because Republicans have hamstrung the entire government towards the agenda of one guy who doesn't know what he wants and doesn't know how to get it even if he did. So I just want to make sure that they're coming in from that point of view, knowing that they're in the right, knowing that they won decisively in November. If America actually wanted this border wall, we would have seen a different outcome in November. Republicans were not shy about calling for that as their chief agenda item.
But so are you therefore saying that the 1.3 or 1.6 being offered by Democrats currently, that you would not counsel your fellow progressives to support that?
I mean, since that's where they decided they needed to be when they offered the first resolution, that makes sense to me. I would certainly hope that that money goes towards things that actually secure the border. We know that we need more technology down there. We know we need more resources down there. What we don't need is a gigantic wall. And I think most rational thinking adults in Washington are aware of that as well.
So, Congressman, what we've heard, too, from Mick Mulvaney just over the weekend, saying that the president is open to other immigration discussions, is open to other immigration solutions. But as you point out, isolating the rest of the Republican Party for the Freedom Caucus over the weekend, what are the chances that there is actually, do you think, a discussion about other ideas, other immigration solutions that is happening right now at the White House?
My guess right now is there's probably zero discussion about a deal between now and January the 3rd. What I do think, though, after January 3rd, when the Democrats take over the House, then I think you'll get into some serious negotiating. And here's what they should negotiate. If I were the Democrats, I'd say, okay, you want some border security funding, Mr. President, I'd say, okay, well, we want the Dreamers. And we had a deal, and there was a deal before, a bipartisan deal, and the president kind of undermined that one. But I would put that back on the table. Joe just mentioned maybe the Mueller protection bill, which I had introduced in the House, actually, with Pete Welsh. And so, yeah, they could put those things on the table and see how much they can get. But I think, a few $1 billion for, border security is a small price to pay for Dreamers and maybe the Mueller protection bill. So I would, if I were the Democrats, I'd start negotiating probably after the new year.
So bringing that back, we should say, because as we pointed out, that has been on the table.
Yeah, bring it back, yes. Yes, correct. Yeah, restoring that, because that was always correct.
And that's always been a priority for Democrats. Joe, you are the veteran of some serious shutdown fights that had massive ramifications, but you're saying basically that right now both sides are dug in because they both think they're winning.
Yes.
And yet the government is shut down, and it looks like it's going to go through the new year. And so there's a question of, if folks think they're winning, then they're assuming no one's getting hurt. And I want to read you a quote by Congressman Scott Perry, Republican of Pennsylvania. Quote, "Who's living like they're not going to make the next paycheck?" He's saying that, hey, it's no big deal. Even if you work for the government, you don't need that money. I'm guessing that some of Mr. Perry's constituents may feel differently. But if that's the attitude in Washington, where's the urgency?
Well, I think the urgency is when the one side realizes they're not winning. And that's how these things play out. Both sides go in with their talking points. They think they're right. And then over time, sometimes it takes 24 hours. Sometimes it takes 3 weeks. It took Newt Gingrich 3 weeks to figure out in 1995 that, boy, I'm losing. I need to get out of here. My speakership is in jeopardy here. And it's a callous way of discussing it as both sides think they're winning. But politically, that's the dynamic. But you're exactly right. There are people who are losing, and when you look at this country from around the world, and we can't light our Christmas tree because we're having a fight, we look like morons.
That's the key point. We look weak and we look dumb. And it's an excuse. This is a Christmas shutdown. And you're going to get a GoFundMe page for the citizens to light the White House Christmas tree.
So you're right. The system loses. The process of faith in government loses. But the reality is both sides are dug in, and one of the sides has to come to the point where they realize this is not working. We need to change. Then a deal will materialize.
So the fact that it's the third of the year, we've never shut down the government 3 times in a year. That like hitting a milestone like that is something that we're not proud of. Nobody likes that idea. So it just makes it even tougher to get out of it. It becomes intractable, but it's not really both sides. It's Republicans and Democrats versus Donald Trump and John Hannity.
Yeah.
Well, and Charlie, let me press you on that point, because the major shutdowns we've seen over the past 25 years, Clinton and Obama, were Republicans in Congress pushing up against a Democratic president. These 3 shutdowns, as Jess just pointed out, have occurred with Republican unified control of Washington. What is the message, or the message the Republicans aren't getting about governing, that they're doing this to themselves and the country?
Well, I think Republicans have to be very sensitive to this point, that this is not simply about a government shutdown at this point. There seems to be, a real concern about the crisis in the White House. With the resignation and the repudiation of Mattis of the Trump doctrine on foreign policy. I think there are a lot of people who believe that there's a crisis. When we look at what's happening, with the Syria, the very abrupt, precipitous pullout in Syria, Mattis's resignation, government shutdown, it just feels like wheels are coming off the wagon, that there's really no good path forward, and there seems to be a crisis of leadership. And I think as Republicans, we have to step up and say we are the party of order, discipline, stability, and that's not what's happening right now. We have to be about small c conservatism right now, and not this lack of this anarchy and chaos that is so disruptive and is causing the markets to tank. It's causing all kinds of problems right now. So I think we have to look at this much more broadly than just a shutdown right now, because shutdowns come and go. And this one will end too. And as I said earlier, the party that makes the policy demand owns the shutdown. And so right now, the Republicans are owning the shutdown. At least the president, I should say, is owning this shutdown. And so there's an easy way out. That's the sad part about this. This is so easy to solve.
Just to push you quickly on one thing you said about basically needing to hear from more Republicans and more Republicans stepping up, speaking out. That hasn't happened. There are rumblings behind the scenes. There are, except for folks who are retiring, there are not a lot of people who are willing to stand up and say, Mr. President, this is wrong. Here's what you have to do. So do you believe that this is going to change things now?
Well, if I were a Senate Republican right now, I would be furious. I mean, they had an agreement last week, and the Senate passed a continuing resolution to fund the government into February, only then to have the president reverse himself. I mean, so these senators put their necks out to pass a funding bill, and it wasn't a hard vote in my view, but the point is there was an agreement, and now the agreement's been, tossed aside. And so I think the Senate Republicans are the ones who are probably going to speak the loudest at this point. I mean, I think they've been speaking up pretty much about this whole Mattis situation in Syria, many of them. But you're right, there needs to be a greater conversation. Now, the House, unfortunately, because of the election, the midterm, many of the, I'll say the more moderate, pragmatic, centrist members of the party, many of them were defeated. And so the House Republican Conference, I think, has become more Trumpian, more pro-Trump than it was prior to the midterm.
And it's going to get worse for the Senate, because the first thing Nancy Pelosi is going to do is pass the bill the Senate passed. And then senators are going to have to face the decision of, am I going to now vote against what I voted for? It's going to be, I was for it before I was against it.
I think you just gave us the Christmas gift of an end game.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Joe, Jess, Charlie, thank you very much for joining us. All right. Now, President Trump ousting his departing Secretary of Defense 2 months early. What message is it sending to our military and allies around the world? We discuss. Defense Secretary James Mattis's resignation letter to President Trump promised to stay in his post through the end of February in the interest of a smooth transition. But sources tell CNN the president is mad about coverage of his resignation, so he's forcing him out next week. It comes after Mr. Trump's sudden decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria and Afghanistan. Joining me now is former NATO Supreme Allied Commander General Wesley Clark and CNN national security commentator and former Republican House Intelligence Chairman Mike Rogers. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. General, let me start with you. CNN reporting that the abrupt decision to withdraw from Syria that started this cascading event occurred after the president spoke with Turkish President Erdogan and essentially said, take it, it's yours, we're out. Turkey is part of the NATO coalition that you once led. How concerned are you about this process or lack thereof and the essential ceding of influence to Turkey and presumably other actors in Erdogan's orbit?
Well, I'm very concerned because there doesn't seem to be any strategic rationale for the decision. And if there's no strategic rationale for the decision, then you have to ask, why was the decision made? I can tell you that people around the world are asking this. And some of our friends and allies in the Middle East are asking, well, did Erdogan blackmail the president? Was there a payoff or something? What is it? Why would a guy make a decision like this? Because all the recommendations were against it. And it looked like that all the facts are against it, too. We're not quite finished with ISIS. We're not taking a lot of casualties over there. The Kurds have been reliable allies. So why do this right now? And this is the matter that's of most concern, or should be of most concern to us, is what does this say about the foreign policy of the United States? That we're not reliable, that we make strategic decisions based on no strategic logic. So what kind of person's driving the helm? That's the issue, but this is a political issue, not a military issue. Jim Mattis took a political post in this administration. His job was to support the President of the United States when all the chips are down. He couldn't do it. He left. Trump's now replaced him. All that is in accordance with the way it should be.
Well, Mike,
it's the policy that's wrong.
Well, and the process. Mike, speaking of politics, this resignation of Jim Mattis seemed to raise objections from Republicans in the Senate and House in a way that we haven't really heard during the Trump era, where generally disagreements have been kept below board. What have you been hearing from your former colleagues? Because it seems like there's a deeper level of concern reflected in this strategic decision.
Well, I think this one's going to leave a mark on the president for a whole host of reasons. And what if you read that Mattis letter, and I think this is why Republicans are getting so concerned, it was broader than just Afghanistan and Syria. It was that for sure. I think that was the tipping point. But if you look back, Mattis was the one that had to go to Japan and reassure our allies after the kind of the giveaway to North Korea on troop discussions there and training exercises. He immediately left for Japan to try to fix that problem, pulling out of the INF with the Russians, and now the Russians running around saying this is going to cause a nuclear problem, which could have been okay if there was a strategy to follow it. There wasn't, and Mattis was the one who was trying to put all that back together, and then abandoning our allies and alliances both in Syria and Afghanistan, I think was probably the last straw for General Mattis. And those Republicans who are in the national security space see this as a significant problem, because, listen, our safety and security is dependent on allies and allegiances around the world, especially in tough neighborhoods. And so when you're willing on a whim and not consult with anyone to undo those alliances or leave people, and it was announced, by the way, John, on the day that the Kurds were engaged in a major offensive, again, once that was completed, would have led to more stability in Syria. It was announced that day when they had troops moving out in combat, contacting with the enemy. I think all of that together was probably too much for General Mattis, as it should have been. And Republicans are now looking at this saying, hey, we're going to need to be more engaged in this national security effort, and let's try to put some strategy around some of these decisions. It's more important than certainly the president. It's more important than a party. It's certainly it is the heart and soul of the United States strategy to make sure that we're safe in the long run.
General Clark, Mike just mentioned the Kurds, and I think as we discussed the alienation or abandonment of allies, that's what you're hearing most of. I mean, Mattis expressing real concern not only about the honor of keeping our commitment, but that our Kurdish allies who we've been training and fighting with may be being set up for a slaughter. How concerned are you about that?
I'm very concerned about it. But the Kurds have lived in a tough neighborhood for generations. We've been supporting them since 1991 at the end of the Gulf War. So it's been almost 30 years of strong U.S. support. They're going to have to find other friends and allies. They're going to have to work their way through an accommodation. And this is what groups in the region do. And what the United States had going for it is the reputation of reliability, consistency, that we were going to be there through thick and thin. A decision on the spur of the moment, as the president made, undercuts all of that. And as Mike was saying, it's not just a decision that affects the Kurds. That kind of a decision sends a message around the world, to South Korea, to our allies in NATO, to Japan. When the going gets tough, or for whatever reason that no one can understand, suddenly a tweet comes out, the policy's changed. This is a really dangerous time for the United States in foreign policy because of this.
Well, and Mike, I mean, the countries that benefit, Turkey, the Assad regime, Iran, Russia, that's all well known, and it sets up a sort of paradoxical balance of power in the region with the U.S. withdrawing. But I want to turn attention to another great power and news that got a little bit overwhelmed in the chaos of late last week, which is the Justice Department indicting 2 Chinese nationals for cyber hacking 45 businesses and the personal information of more than 100,000 Navy personnel. Now, you worked in law enforcement before Congress. I know this sort of thing doesn't always get the attention it does, but tell me what your concerns are about this kind of Chinese hacking that we see persistently and the administration's attempt to push back on it more aggressively than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, this is one thing that the Trump administration is getting exactly right. They are pushing very hard against Chinese economic espionage. And unfortunately, it does get lost in the headlines that the Chinese have ramped up their ability to steal intellectual property in the United States. It is breathtaking. Over $1 trillion of lost intellectual property over the last decade plus to the Chinese. And what that means is they're stealing business plans, taking them back, and certainly the intellectual property of a product, repurposing it and competing against U.S. companies. That's why this is so significant. It may not cost you a job today. It will cost you a job in the future. And the sheer level of effort on Chinese espionage targeted against the United States is unbelievable. And it's not just cyber hacking, it's also human intelligence and espionage efforts here in the United States. And you're noticing a large number of indictments from where we're catching Chinese spies operating in the United States. This is a huge and significant national security threat that I don't think we have completely got our arms around. And so we're going to have to continue to push back. That hacking that you saw allows their intelligence officials to understand Navy personnel in a way that any counterintelligence, I used to be an FBI guy, any counterintelligence agent would love to have, because now that means I can profile you and figure out a way to try to recruit or compromise you. This is really dangerous stuff.
It's a big deal. All right, Congressman General, thank you very much for joining us on New Day, and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
President Trump directing his Treasury Secretary to call execs at U.S. banks in hopes of stabilizing the volatile markets. New details, breaking details on the extraordinary move. Next. Breaking news this morning out of the White House. CNN has learned President Trump has been pressuring his Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, over concerns about the markets. The Dow, of course, having its worst week in a decade. The president, we understand, also remains upset with Fed Chief Jerome Powell, whom Mnuchin recommended for the post. The president blaming Powell for the drop in the stock market, which looks set to possibly drop again when it opens just about an hour from now. CNN chief business correspondent Christine Romans joining us now with more. There's also these questions of these phone calls that Steve Mnuchin made from Mexico over the weekend to the heads of top banks to sort of try to reassure them. Could these two be connected?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think the Treasury Secretary is under intense pressure from the president because the president has tied his own fortunes to the fortunes of the stock market. How many times have we heard him talk about the Dow is up 25%? It's the best stock market in the history of mankind, you know. And now you have a Dow last week that was the worst week since the financial crisis. December on track for the worst month since the Great Depression. And these are comparisons that must gall this president. And he wants the Fed chief or the Treasury Secretary to do something. At the same time, he's bashing his Fed chief. He blames the Treasury Secretary for the Fed chief pick because he was I mean, look, no matter who is the Fed chief, you're going to see interest rates rising. There's no question about that. This president is just very angry about it.
But I mean, look, it doesn't take an economist to understand that if the president of the United States attacks his Fed chair, and then it's leaked over the weekend that he's been talking about firing him, that will be a prime driver of the stock market down. That's got to rattle the confidence of markets.
It does not inspire confidence. What also does not inspire confidence is when the Treasury Secretary, under pressure from the president, our White House team is reporting, sends out this press release after these phone calls. He's on vacation in Cabo San Lucas. He sends out this press release about the calls with the big bank CEOs. How populist is this, right?
It's very populist to go. Christmas in Cabo
ship to shore, to the most powerful bankers in the world. And he says there is ample liquidity in the system. The CEOs of these banks have assured us there's ample liquidity in the system. And the money reporters and the money folks and the financial experts are like, well, the Treasury Secretary just issued a statement saying there's ample liquidity. Of course there's ample liquidity in the system. Nobody thought there wasn't. So it's injecting this doubt into the whole thing that there's a Democratic senator who said it's like being the head of the health department and issuing a press release saying the water is safe to drink. Well, wait a minute, the water couldn't be safe to drink? It's like a spouse saying to the other spouse, don't worry, honey, I'm not cheating on you. Wait, there could be a possibility you're cheating on me? I mean, that's what the kind of doubt that it injected into the conversation. And it just was a very clumsy message if indeed this is the Treasury Secretary under pressure from the president to fix the declines in the stock market.
The clumsiest message. You couldn't design something more to undermine confidence than say, everyone's got enough liquidity, folks. Nothing to worry about here. Remain calm.
And shouldn't a Treasury Secretary know that putting out a statement like that and injecting that into the discussion?
Or what is the infrastructure around it? So I called the Treasury Press Affairs number about a half an hour ago. I was like, look, I'm just gonna beg somebody over there to come on the record and tell me, are you guys gonna, try to clean up this message? It goes to an operator number because the press office, they're all they're on furlough. So that sort of shows you the merger of, a market that's, look, this could be a garden variety correction in the market. These things happen. It could be that there's high frequency trading and algorithm trading that kind of is exacerbating the volatility. That's one thing. But it sounds as though they're trying to message away from the president's attacks on the Fed chief, the president's shutdown, or Pelosi's shutdown, or whoever you want to blame for it. The fact that the economy, a year after tax cuts, maybe they weren't as much juice as they thought.
Is there any precedent for a president going after his Fed chair to this extent?
I think so. I know, well, publicly, I don't think so.
Publicly.
But look, every president has not liked rising interest rates. There's no question about that. And they've grumbled about it. But this is, I've never reported on a president privately asking his aides, can I fire my Fed chief? And having to be told, no, you can't fire your Fed chief. And even if you had the authority to fire the Fed chief, the message that would send around the world would be very devastating.
Tough stuff.
It's so much for a government shutdown, right? It's just there's so much happening. Open up a door and there's something else
There's something else there. It's like an advent calendar.
It's an advent calendar of disaster.
It's Christmas Eve.
Yes.
But will it be over tomorrow?
No, there are going to be a lot of presents under that tree tomorrow. Not the kind you want. Christine, thank you. We do also have some more breaking. Day 3 of a partial government shutdown that frankly didn't have to be at all. President Trump again rejecting a bipartisan deal to fund the government. All of this over the president's demand for billions more for his border wall. Let's get the bottom line with CNN political analyst and national political correspondent for the New York Times, Jonathan Martin, and CNN political analyst and national correspondent for Bloomberg Businessweek, Joshua Green. Gentlemen, always good to see both of you in the morning. Jonathan, as we look at this, I mean, the bottom line here really is that this shutdown didn't have to happen. Now it's day 3. The president said he would own it. He doesn't want to own it. Right. And here we sit, waiting for the new Congress.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see any scenario where Democrats would give in at this point, seeing as how they're going to have control of one chamber of Congress here in a matter of days. So it's hard to see how this gets resolved. It's an odd shutdown for those of us who have covered politics for a long time. There's usually a measure of urgency about these issues because the two parties don't want to be blamed. You just don't see that this time, guys. There's almost a kind of resignation. I think that's in part because of the sort of change in power in the House that's coming. I also, frankly, think it's in part because the Republicans can't really prosecute the case against the Democrats because of what the president has said. You know, you don't see Mitch McConnell, for example, out there, lashing Democrats left and right. You see him offering a kind of like 101 level civics class about how to fund the government, telling the president, not very subtly, that he needs to get Democratic votes and that he then needs to sign the bill. It's very fascinating to watch his comments. They're totally targeted at the president and not Democrats. But so this is a very different kind of shutdown here.
J-Mart, are you suggesting that we actually just elevate McConnell to do a Schoolhouse Rock, and that's the Christmas gift to the country?
I'd love to see it. He's already halfway there, John.
Okay, I'm just checking on that. Now, Joshua, here's my question, because normally a Christmas shutdown would be bad political news. This is self-inflicted. Republicans have unified control, and it comes, of course, at the same time that Republicans have begun to really speak up and speak out against the resignation of James Mattis. My question to you is, do you see us beginning to see fissures in the Republican coalition that aren't just quiet expressions of discomfort, but real concerns by Republicans in Congress with this president?
Yeah, I do. And I think there are a couple things happening here. What you're beginning to hear publicly are the same complaints that a lot of reporters have been hearing privately, going all the way back to the beginning of the Trump administration. They've gotten louder over the summer. But I think the twin blows of Mattis resigning essentially in disgust, the fact that one of the few remaining adults has gone has really put fear into a lot of Republicans who are beginning to understand in a very real and visceral way that things could go very badly from here on out. I think the other factor here is, we at Bloomberg reported on Friday night that Trump was suddenly obsessed with the possibility of firing Fed Chairman Jay Powell over interest rate hikes, over Fed quantitative tightening. That is something that sent a scare through the market. I got calls all day on Saturday. I got a call from a congressman on Saturday worried because they understand in a way I think that perhaps Trump does not, the kind of immediate and severe economic fallout that would occur were Trump to take that step. I think the unprecedented press release that we saw from the Treasury, where the Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin is calling around to banks, essentially checking in to say, hey, is everything okay, is a reflection of the fact that people inside the government, if not Trump himself, understand how serious a threat that is. I think that's woken up a lot of people who might not have been quite as public in their criticism before. Now they are willing to speak up and say, hey, this is not something that we can live with.
Which will be fascinating to see how much of that we see and hear from them. Because, Jonathan, there's also reporting from both the New York Times, from the Washington Post, about how this president is increasingly isolated, tweeting 23 times since the shutdown, holed up in the White House, watching a lot of TV. And we know he has said multiple times, even as recently as less than a month ago, he goes with his gut, because his gut oftentimes knows more than a lot of other people.
Yeah, and I tell you, I was in the Capitol on Friday, guys, talking to members of Congress, and I can't recall a time where, in the first 2 years of this presidency, where you had so many Republican lawmakers who were expressing their concerns openly and on the record. To Josh's point, we've heard this privately for a couple of years now, lots of eye rolling, lots of snickering, and lots of sort of WTF, but we have not sort of seen this on the record like we did last Friday. And by the way, not just from Bob Corker, who, of course, I think kind of relishes now poking President Trump, and Trump now swipes back. They've kind of had this on-again, off-again feud. But from, rank and file senators like Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, Pat Roberts from Kansas, who are not typically outspoken critics of this president, who do not like what they have seen. I think Josh is right. I think the Mattis resignation over the abrupt Syria decision was something of a tipping point. The question is, what does that add up to besides sort of rhetorical condemnations? It's not clear to me yet, but we are at a point now where you do see more open critiques from his own party than we have probably in the previous 2 years.
All right. It's a chaotic Christmas ahead. J-Mart, Joshua, thank you very much for joining us on
Thank you.
All right. Well, they've lost their home, but not their hope on this holiday.